Chapter 20 of Tractate Shabbos begins by discussing some laws of preparation of food on Shabbos and holidays. You can suspend a strainer on holidays only, but you can pour stuff into a suspended strainer on holidays or a Shabbos. Others say we cannot suspend a strainer even on holidays, and you can only pour into a strainer on holidays. The Gemara debates the comparison of the setting up a strainer case to generally constructing a temporary tent on a holiday. We said that the strainer is lenient, as it's a preliminary to food preparation, and others definitely allow it, as they permit even preliminaries that could have been done before a holiday. According to the opinion that you cannot suspend the strainer, that's a rabbinic violation based on a similar case of suspending a jug from a peg, so you don't act in the manner you do during the week. This is discussed further. We also prove that the straining itself, if not allowed, is a biblical prohibition. Some say it's an issue of selecting, as you're taking out the good food and leaving the undesired behind. Some say it's an issue of sifting, as the undesired food stays on top, and the desired food falls below. There's discussion on bed assembly, some allow the bed, some also allow the canopy, and similar. The dimensions are discussed and how they compare to a felt hat. You can't wear the hat if it's loose. There's further points on not doing parts of bed assembly on Shabbos. This gets into a point of bread baking and the laws of impurity if you find a sheretz creature in the oven. It also says that if the Jewish people are suffering, look at the deeds of their judges, and it lists many points on the tremendously negative impact of a corrupt judiciary. It also says an unrelated point that when Yosef was exiled to Egypt, him and his brothers stopped drinking wine. It also says that in the merit that God testified about Aaron merited to wear the chosh and mishpat breastplate upon his heart. It says further that you shouldn't build a canopy on a Shabbos, and also certain people weren't informed of leniencies in case they started making up their own stuff. There's also points on growing stuff in a vineyard that regards to forbidden mixtures. Also regarding a corpse that needs burial, you should have non-Jewish people bury it on the first day of a holiday, and on the second day you can bury it. But that again wasn't told to certain people in case they started making up their own stuff. There's further points on if you can wrap yourself in a canopy to be able to carry the attached strings. This is not comparable to tzitzis, as tzitzis strings are significant, unlike by a canopy. Some say that you can set up a strainer by setting it up just to hold pomegranates, and then you can use the strainer. Some say this is only allowed if you actually use it to hold pomegranates, as it's clear that a usually prohibited act is intended. Some other tricks that were used, someone plugged up a spigot with a piece of garlic, saying he wanted to put the garlic away, and someone once crossed a river by sleeping in a boat and then said he was just sleeping. These exceptions were allowed as they were circumventing rabbinic prohibitions, and they were done by Torah sages who wouldn't violate the prohibition without this method. New Mishnah. You can pour water over wine dregs so that way they're cleared out. You can filter wine through cloth or through a basket made of palm twigs. You can put an egg into a mustard strainer. A drink called inulmin, which was wine, honey, and pepper, can be made on Shabbos. Some say only in a cup, and on a holiday in a bottle, and on an intermediate holiday day it can be made in a barrel. Others say it depends on your number of guests. The Gemara says that some allow pouring clear wine or water through a strainer, but not murky liquids. You can strain wine if it's being drunk right by the wine press, as that's usually intended to be unfiltered. You can filter the wine through the cloth, as long as you don't make a hollow in the cloth. You can use the palm basket as long as there's not a handbreadth gap between the basket strainer and the container, and there are similar points mentioned. You can strain the egg, as it's only done for coloring. It discusses a longer piece of preparing mustard on Shabbos and points on cress and mint, and it says that mint benefits cress. It gives the definition of the inulmin mixture and says it's very good and has a strong cooling effect, although it doesn't affect you as much if you drink it daily, like one sage did. New Mishnah. Asafoetida, a root resin, cannot be soaked in warm water, but it's allowed in vinegar. You can't pour water on vetch so the refuse separates and floats to the top, and you also can't rub them to separate the refuse. You may put them in a sieve or basket, even though the refuse can fall through and be sorted. No sifting straw with a sieve, and no putting it up high so the chaff drops out, but you can scoop it into a sieve and pour it into a feeding trough. The Gemara says that some don't allow soaking asafoetida in warm water as a rabbinic prohibition, so you're not acting in the same manner as the rest of the week. The majority opinion is that soaking it in cold water is prohibited. It also says that asafoetida is good for alleviating chest pain, and it gives some instances. It also says you can rub a freshly laundered linen shirt, as it's done to soften the shirt, not to make it brighter. That's not allowed by a kerchief because it looks like you're trying to make it brighter. It also says that you can remove this shirt from a rod, but you can't remove the rod from the shirt. Some allow it by a weaver's rod. Similarly, a string of raw meat can be moved, as it can be eaten, but not of raw fish, as that's not eaten raw. Just some general pieces of advice. It's very improper to stay in the bed of a married couple, as it'll lead to improper thoughts. Some allow it. It also says when buying vegetables or reeds, buy longer ones, as then you have more. It also says not to eat herbs when you don't have bread to satisfy your appetite. Some didn't eat herbs even when they were rich, because they then just had meat and fish. It further gives advice as to what you should do when you're poor, how you should portion your food, and general advice for meat and clothes purchasing. He also gave lots of advice to his daughters in regards to being modest with their husbands. In regards to floating vetch, some disagree about using a sieve. New Mishnah: you can sweep a trough before a stall ox. You can also move excess fodder to the sides of the stall so the excrement doesn't ruin it. Others disagree. You can take feed from before one animal and put it before a different animal on Shabbos. The Gemara says that actually both statements of the Mishnah are disagreed on. In regards to sweeping the trough, they argue if it's allowed if it's a utensil. They agree it's not allowed where it's an earthenware trough, as you'll even out crevices. Regarding taking feed from one animal to another, we allow taking from a donkey to give to an ox, but no taking from an ox to give to a donkey, as oxen drool and ruin the feed, and are also picky eaters. New Mishnah: straw on a bed may not be moved by hand, but may be moved with your body, in an unusual manner of moving it. If it was animal feed or a pillow or sheet left from before Shabbos, you can move it by hand. You can also release a clothing press of a householder to get your clothes on Shabbos, but you cannot press it down. No releasing or pressing a clothing press with a launderer's clothing press. If it was partially released before Shabbos, you can release it all the way to remove the garment. The Gemara refutes an opinion that indirect movement of Muktzeh is not allowed, involving a case with moving a radish from dirt. Some allow crushing many peppers at a time with a knife handle, as that's not a normal manner of crushing. It also talks about drying yourself before leaving water, so you don't carry water on your body. There's no issue of entering water, as the water that's being pushed by your force past 4 cubits is in a carmelis. It also talks about scraping clay off your foot, potentially an issue when it's onto a wall, as it resembles building, potentially an issue onto the ground, in case you level a hole. Some allow on a wall or on the ground, some allow neither, and some allow it on a beam. No rocking a barrel back and forth in case you level a hole in the ground. Also, no packing wet cloth into a jug's mouth in case you end up squeezing liquids out of the garment. If there's clay on your garment, you can rub only from the inside of the garment. Some allow only scraping clay off a new shoe with the back of a knife. Others allow it. There's also a point about putting oil on yourself and touching leather, for instance on your foot, and then putting it in a shoe. Some allow it if it's enough to polish the leather and not to tan it. It lists some other miscellaneous things not to wear out on Shabbos in regards to shoes. There's also an argument over removing a shoe from a shoe mold, depending on if it's fastened on loosely or not. That's the end of chapter 20.